You got the right button pressed?
Yeah, here you
Okay.
go.
Okay, so
yard, I'm not sure where you are, but.
yeah, no, we'll just pick up basically where we left off. So this next one is I've titled it Affordable and Attainable Housing Stock. It in many ways is related to the first item that we talked, which was the water and density. They are kind of all linked together. So essentially in the draft documents, there is an aim to increase, and we've called it gentle density or gradual density, and that's primarily through allowing secondary accessory dwelling units and again the 2-unit dwellings in the R2 zone, as well as the proposal for the reduced lot size in R1. Overall, I'd say the combination of proposals received mixed reactions. Obviously, the R1 zone, we had some quite negative response, which fair enough, and we've talked about that. But some of the other items here in the accessory dwelling units where, like I said, mixed reaction. But generally the goal to lower the cost of housing through increasing housing stock was not well received. We heard issues, again, related to water, traffic, the cost of land in the village were all offered as reasons basically why trying to increase affordable and attainable housing stock was not viable or really a worthwhile objective. There were many comments that affordability is not something that's going to happen in the village. It should happen outside the village. That was the majority of the sentiment. And there didn't seem to be a lot of wiggle room on should we try to improve things, even if it's never going to be truly, affordable at a minimum wage. That didn't seem to get much in terms of a response. So, again, the options here are somewhat similar to those first set, which we decided to maybe revisit. But whether or not we're ready to make decisions here. So again, this would be to limit new development to precisely what's allowed under the current plan. That would be to basically strip out everything that's new and just keep the dwelling unit numbers exactly the same. We could remove the ability to create the accessory dwelling unit per lot, which we proposed for every lot in the village, as long as they can meet the setback requirements. Again, we could remove that ability to create the 2-unit dwellings in the R2 zone, but as I mentioned, there's already that conversion clause, so really that's not, that would be taking away, in a sense, from what's already permitted.
Allowed, yeah.
And then again, make no changes in that area. So I'm not sure if there's going to be a, or if we want to revisit this as that whole water and density discussion. Basically when affordable and attainable housing was brought up, it was not well received. And we aren't talking about subsidized housing. We're just talking about trying to allow for the creation of new housing units in the hopes that more supply will help to counter increased prices.
Well, it's two different things, because even if it would be attainable, any building lot in the village is not affordable.
It's not going to be.
I'm sorry, but for the average person, it isn't.
Right.
So I see in this area, development is going to happen outside of the village core. And it's already, whether it goes ahead, Stanford Lake area, or wherever, is where the development will happen. It just, lots in the village aren't affordable. I don't know, they may be attainable, but they're certainly not affordable.
Andre?
I agree. I agree with what you said, and I think that it's been council's direction so far in this mandate that we want to expand our catchment area outside on the other side of the 3, where we can put, density, maybe the likes of which we haven't really seen here before. Not to say it's going to be skyscrapers, but it might be a little bit bigger buildings than we're a little used to, because there's a need. And that's going to happen, and I'm sure we'll have many discussions with all kinds of interested parties when that does happen. But the province now is taking an interest in land use, and what's in the news right now with HRM, because they're obviously the low-hanging fruit for housing. But I understand the intent is then to move out into rural areas and make sure that our land use bylaws are aligned with their housing policies. So we have now in R1 and R2 the ability to create secondary units. All we're doing, I feel, with this proposal is adding a tweak to that and adding more architectural controls so you don't end up with row housing and ugly housing that doesn't fit. I would rather, if we're going to try to comply with what the province intends or wants for us, I would rather do it on our terms with the controls we wish to have than have them interfere and do it on their terms.
Any other comments?
No, I agree with Andre.
Generally maintain on those.
Maintain
Don't take
existing.
those pieces.
And the accessory buildings, I mean, we've talked about that for years. I mean, that's something we're going to do. So,
Great.
Yeah, we know the growth is going to be outside the village.
Yeah, the true density, yeah,
and when
absolutely.
we look at water, which is the big issue in the village, I mean, water likely will probably start outside the village where the new development will have to be. Because a lot of this development you're talking about still needs water. So water has to come from somewhere. I can see it happening up there and then eventually making its way in.
Yes.
So we more or less as is.
Realistically, this type of housing that we're talking about is where you have people and they want to take care of their aging parents, or, you know, maybe, you know, the kids before they, you know, can buy a house on their own, they have their own space. You create a space and it's shared space in the property, you know, and then on occasion you're going to have people that are created and they just want some secondary income, and their province has now incentivized that by providing a grant that's, you know, forgivable. But these are small, like, secondary units that are not intended to be the same size as the primary unit. They're not intended to be obvious. And I think that is in character, I believe that's in keeping with the character of the village, which we want to preserve. Because we understand it's a jewel.
Okay.
Agreed.
Got that?
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so the next one was on parking. So parking comments related to parking ranged from, we did get support for the proposed exemption for commercial parking in the core commercial zone. However, we did hear some concerns, not unexpected, with congestion and parking on both sides of the street. And some of those issues, again, move us out of the land use bylaw into more of a, because we're all familiar with, you know, the provincial authority for controlling traffic and that kind of thing rests
And
with
the whole
Department of
traffic study
Transportation.
piece. And all that.
Right, and that's right. So, so we heard some calls to create a municipal parking lot. Presumably more in the downtown core. We have a couple, but not in the core. We heard comments that we should prohibit commercial parking lots in order to avoid a case where a developer might see it worthwhile to take a building down in order to create commercial parking. And just as a note, in the core commercial zone, commercial parking lots have been removed. That was done prior to hearing this, but this supports essentially what is in there. There were some comments that it would be nice to see parking permitted only on one side of the street. So again, that is related a bit more to the traffic study and those discussions and potential pilot programs and those kind of things. And then there was, I think it was a single comment, but I guess at least one comment that our parking space size requirement, so we have a parking spaces defined with dimensions, was suggesting that we base those on smaller compact vehicles as opposed to basing it on a larger, say like a pickup truck. So that
Yeah,
was
we're gonna have to meet the requirements for accessibility standards and all that.
right, yes.
No, that's standardized, we don't
Yeah.
have to do that.
So that was the summary. So in terms of options here, it would be, you know, potentially direct staff to prepare a broader range of options to, you know, address other parking concerns. We've talked about these things before, like is there a desire to do, you know, parking enforcement and metered parking or anything like that, or bylaw enforcement of you know, on-street parking. Again, we could reduce the required size of parking spaces, although that would come with some issues, because then if somebody did end up there with a truck, they are either going to take up 1.5 spaces or they'd have to, you know, find somewhere else. And then the third one would be to, again, make no changes in that area.
Well, we do have trucks. You gotta park too.
Yeah.
Number 3 is Wiles.
Okay.
What, so
I'm glad you got good consensus on the commercial question, so that's good.
Yeah, that seemed to receive good support. And actually, I'm going to revisit that as a potential something to look at expanding a little bit later.
so what direction do we want to get?
I suggest no changes, that's all,
Leave it alone?
in the market. Yeah.
Okay?
It's kind of our
All right, the next one is similar, sort of a single issue. So this was related to the proposed regulations for solar panels. So we didn't get a significant number of comments. We are proposing to allow solar panels attached to a building or separate. But we did hear from a couple of folks that the proposed regulations for solar panels that are connected to a building, we had proposed a height exemption of 2 meters. So if it was an existing building, for example, and they were built right to the max, or if there was a need to create some space between the shingles and the panels themselves for airflow or for other reasons, we allowed that 2 meter height exemption. We heard some comments that would take away from the aesthetics and character of the village, because you might see, the rooftops and then this metal structures across that when you view it, from the water or from a distance. So the options, again, this was kind of a single issue one, and the options here are essentially to remove the allowance for the 2 meter exemption or make no changes. If we remove, just to be clear, if we remove that exemption, it will still allow on-building panels. They would just be counted as part of the structure when we're looking at the height of the building.
Yeah.
So what it might mean,
Required.
right, exactly. So maybe if you had an existing building, maybe you wouldn't be able to put panels right at the peak. Maybe you'd have to,
Put them
if it
down
was
a
going to
lot.
exceed the height. Yeah, those kind of
So
decisions.
does it speak to anything about solar panels you see people have them on the ground in your yard?
Yeah, so we do have regulations for those too. We treat them more like an accessory structures. They have setbacks, and there's a maximum size of square meters of panel you can have. Yeah. And we didn't have any comments on that side of it. It was just on this allowing them to get taller
I know there are
than the roof line.
exceptions, but most of those panels are sort of flat to the roof.
Very.
I think so. Yeah. So I personally don't see any issue with removing that.
Remove it.
Just remove it.
Yeah. Okay.
Unless somebody else thinks that.
I told you some of these would be a little quicker. Okay, the next one, so now we're talking about the residential 2 zone, which currently is the central village residential zone. So that's the majority of the residential properties here in the village that aren't in the core commercial zone.
Yeah.
So generally, the R2 zone was well received at the public sessions. There was a comment that try to keep this as clear as possible. So we have lot coverage provisions for both R1 and R2, and they work a little bit differently, but there are lot coverage provisions. And there is one type of structure defined in the bylaw as a small accessory structure. It's basically 20 square meters or less, and that does not count towards lot coverage.
Yeah.
But there is a limited number per lot that you can build. In the R1 zone, you can build 2 of them because of generally the larger lot sizes. In the R2 zone, we proposed that you could only build a single one. The comment that we heard in relation to that was, well, you're allowing 2-unit dwellings in the R2 zone. You should allow each of those units to have their own little shed for lawnmowers or whatnot. So that was what that comment was about, that in the R2 zone, we should allow, rather than 1 small accessory structure, we should allow 2 small accessory structures.
Just remind me exactly where the R2 zone is.
So it's basically all around us here. It's the what I would refer to as the core. So just from sort of Highway 3 south, virtually to the peninsula. There's Pleasant Street, in Duke, we've got commercial zoning there, but otherwise it's the vast majority of, So we heard that comment expressed. We also heard, in the draft documents, we had proposed to reduce the setbacks in that zone. Currently, they're 3 meters, and we had proposed to reduce them to 1.5 meters. So we heard that was not well received. People would like to see that go back. And I think there was a valid point made that when you look around, the majority of the existing structures already meet or exceed that 3 meter setback. And so if we went to 1.5, that could have an effect on the character of those lots by allowing new buildings to go much closer to the lot line. And the last point is just essentially to reflect that would change the look and the feel of the zone for the worse. So when we look at options here, the first one would be to allow that 2 small accessory structures in the R2 zone. And then the second one would be to essentially revert the setback back to the 3 meters or some other number if we
make
so
no
chose,
change.
or make no changes.
I agree with those. Steve.
So
With what?
with,
I agree with,
with both of
Increase the
those,
setback.
both of those changes? Okay. Increase setback.
go back to the 3 meters.
Yeah.
Back to that, do you agree to the 2 structures or just the meters?
Oh, 1 and 2, I
Yeah.
would agree with.
Okay.
Okay.
I think that,
How many buildings could that end up being? I'm just curious.
yeah, so so let's try to, if we went for the sort of the maximum, you'd have a main building that could potentially have 2 dwelling units. You could have, and this is assuming you could make all the sizes work with the lot coverage provisions and your setbacks. You could have an accessory dwelling unit in the backyard, like a garden suite, and that's limited in size.
Yeah.
And then you could have potentially 2, you'd have those 2 garden sheds. So,
That could be 100 number of buildings, could it? Or-
No, I don't
No.
think we should have that.
No,
Get
one
rid of
shed.
That sounds
One
like-
shed, if you can make a house that has 2 units in it, you can make a shed that has 2 units in it.
sure, yeah, and that's another way to.
Yeah, you can divide the shed, yeah.
We generally don't limit the number of accessory structures. The reason we're limiting these small accessory structures is because they don't count towards the lot coverage.
Yeah.
So if you built a garage, a typical kind of accessory structure, that is going to count towards your maximum percentage of
What
the
is
lot
the size of an
Small.
accessory structure that you can create?
Yeah.
without counting, or
Yeah.
yeah. So it's 20 square meters is the cutoff for small accessory structures are defined as 20 square
600
meters.
square feet.
About 215 each.
Yeah, it's the building
The
permit
minimum.
cutoff. Yeah.
So yeah, it's the same as the building.
That's a pretty big building.
It is actually, yeah.
That's plenty big.
For
Put
2
all the
people.
lawnmowers you want.
So one structure,
Go on, or go there, there.
Yeah.
So,
Not 2.
so there seems to be consensus on the setback to revert that to the 3
yeah,
meters
and one structure.
and
One
leave
shed.
it as 1 structure per lot.
This is one undersized accessory.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, the small accessories.
Yeah.
I've seen situations where there are multiple undersized accessory structures on the same lot,
Right.
which is not good.
Right, and then this would limit that to
Limit it.
1. Yeah.
Well, this would only, and correct me if I'm wrong,
Yep.
and I apologize for jumping in, but just to be clear, this whole discussion is on the exemption out of the lot coverage. This isn't a discussion, unless you want to change the discussion, on how many accessory structures, garages, small little buildings you could have.
Right.
It's just saying if you have 5 small buildings, 4 of them will count towards your lot coverage limit, 1 won't. And so some of the feedback was because in the R1 zone, state residential now, we're saying 2 of those wouldn't count towards your lot coverage. But you could still have a plethora of buildings. The comment was, why don't we have that here in the village side of, we have that exemption for lot coverage for 2. But just so you're really clear, this is not going to change the number of small buildings you might have, somebody might want to put on the lot. It's just changing how many of them will be okay
Count
and not
towards.
count.
Right, that's
Exactly.
right.
So if you had a big enough lot, you could put more.
That's right.
Right, exactly.
I've
Exactly.
seen somewhere
Yes.
the lot's quite small.
And they got too many.
They stick as many in.
And they throw a
Right.
whole bunch of them on.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we're gonna limit it.
Okay, so we'll leave it at one small accessory structure per lot, but we will revert the setbacks to 3 meters.
Back to 3 meters, yeah.
Okay. All right, so next, the institutional zone. So just again, a reminder, for most of our zones, they are limited to specific character areas, which are mapped. So certain zones can only occur in certain character areas, but there's a couple of zones, the institutional zone being one of which, can occur in any character area through a rezoning application. So generally, there weren't a lot of comments around the institutional zones. However, we did hear some concerns expressed with the ability to have an institutional zone go anywhere, and the uses that are proposed. And I think the primary one that was creating potentially some concern was we have that subsidized or not-for-profit housing would be allowed in the institutional zone by development agreement. So there was some concern expressed around that zone just being allowed to go anywhere, and whether or not that should be limited to particular areas or whether certain uses should be pulled out of the institutional zone. The other, I guess, issue here, which was again sort of a one-off, was so we discussed with the yacht club and the golf course because both of those uses, from a staff perspective, fit well within the institutional zone. The golf course was happy to have that change, and so that's been done on the draft maps. However, the yacht club was not in favor, and so they would like to remain, essentially what they will be, or whether they'd like to or not, will be a non-conforming use in the waterfront zone if they're not changed to institutional. And so the options here, again, would be to comply with the wishes of the Chester Yacht Club. We would revert that to it would be the waterfront zone, and they would remain as an existing
How
zone.
does it change things for them with one way or the other?
If they took the institutional zone, it would theoretically allow for, you know, expansion or new uses down the road. It would give them more flexibility. Now, if they wanted to expand, say, onto a neighboring property, they'd still have to come forward and get that property rezoned institutional as well in order to, you know, extend the use across. But it would essentially take them from being a non-conforming use and make them a permitted use in the zone, which I think generally is seen as a good thing from a staff perspective.
Well, you'd think it would.
And it wasn't totally clear. I mean, they did say they don't have any expansion plans and that kind of thing. That was related to some of that, but I don't have a definitive answer for exactly why.
The new zone would be too useful.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, Gareth, could you have, maybe it's in the strategy that if they did decide they wanted to move to institutional,
Right, and
that would be
Yeah.
allowed in the strategy?
yeah, absolutely. And so if they
I'm not
did,
saying they want to, but if.
that's right. If in the future there was a change made and they did decide they needed to do something, they could certainly come forward and ask for a
And it would
rezone.
comply with the MPS.
Right, right. Yep. So that's
But right now, they're not in compliance with the zone they're in.
right. It's a
So you can't
residential.
really do anything.
They're basically limited to the existing
You think
uses.
they'd want to be able
But you
to?
would, I don't know what the reason.
Like, I don't, what's the grievance here?
No money.
I wasn't clear on
Is
that.
there a tax implication if they change their zone?
No, it's based on the use of the property, not the zoning. It wasn't clear to me.
To me, we should do what's right and legitimize the use that's there. That probably will continue on for another 100 years, I would guess.
Yeah, I don't get the problem really, to be honest with
It
you.
just doesn't sound like they fully
Yeah, I
understand.
think it would help.
This is only a benefit.
We had a meeting early on and had some preliminary discussions, and I will own up to this. I mistakenly left that meeting thinking they were generally in favor with some questions to follow, and I made that comment at one of the public meetings and was called out as saying, no, we don't want this. And so I reached out to them, clarified with them, you want to stay non-conforming? Yes, we do. That's in the feedback there.
I think that we should continue on with institutional. We should invite them in to tell them our intent, and if they wish
they
to
can
explain
explain
why they don't want to, we'd like to hear it, but I think that we should invite them in.
If you're non-conforming use and we're gonna make you in compliance, I don't get the problem, quite frankly, but it must be something I don't know.
Somebody want to build something new, they don't.
So, okay, sure. So we'll leave it as is, but we'll reach out for an invitation for a meeting or a discussion. Yep.
Yeah, explain to us why that's the problem.
Okay, the next option, if we wished, again, would be to look at revising the list of permitted uses in the institutional zone to respond to those concerns raised about, you know, where the zone could go and what could be developed within it. We could alter policy statements so that the institutional zone is only permitted in select character areas, although I think that's going to limit us, because then if, you know, the institutional includes things like recreation facility, you know, so there's all kinds of things that we might, and that was why we drafted it the way we did, where that it's automatically applied to existing institutional uses, but it could be applied to any new property if council felt it was in the best interest of the municipality to do so, and that would go through the normal rezoning process with public input and all that kind of thing. So, and then of course, final option is make no changes. So, so we've got option one, and just if there's anything else, or if we're
Revise the list, I mean, that's what you're suggesting?
Not necessarily. That would be if, so maybe we can take a quick look here. So again, in the land use bylaw, so the second document, the institutional zone is on page 97.
Okay.
And that, just if we want to have a quick look at the types of uses that are in there. So again, I think the one that was catching people maybe a little bit off guard, and this is new,
Was the housing.
was the housing piece, and that was something I intentionally added. And specifically, it says subsidized or affordable housing project owned by a not-for-profit organization or a non-municipal government body, so like a provincial housing project or something like that. And that would still go through a development agreement, so it's not an as of right. Then as you see here, we've got, arenas, rinks, medical clinics, religious institutions, childcare facilities, educational institutions, emergency services, hospitals, libraries, museums, art galleries, nursing homes, those kind of things. So the revision would only be if there's some uses there that we'd like to pull out of it. Yeah. Most of them are existing, with, like I said, the housing being one of the
housing
ones.
is the
Yeah,
main
that's the
one.
main addition.
And that applies to what institutions, like,
So what it could be is, let's say somebody came forward, a not-for-profit came forward and said, we're looking at this piece of land and we'd like to do housing on it. And then if it fit the zone and the plan, council could consider rezoning that lot to institutional to enable that project to take place.
The approval process is by development agreement.
For the housing, yes.
To me, that it's an option that I think is, like, I think of Bonnie Farms group home,
yeah, it's a
best neighbors you'd ever want.
Yep.
And I've never heard a complaint ever about that. I
Yeah,
wish they were my neighbors.
Right.
yeah.
This allows that to happen, and it gives control, so you keep the riffraff out when you want them out.
Yeah, you do it by development agreement, it's all a public process, so. Yeah,
Okay, so we can just basically keep the yacht club and reach out to them to have a discussion around that.
yeah.
Okay, next one was the revised height limit calculations. So generally these, and some people might be surprised to hear this, generally that was well received after all the discussions on height we've had over the years. But I think that reflects, again, that came strongly out of the work that FBM did, and they'd already discussed some of those changes. And it's not a sea change that we're looking at here. It's tweaks to the existing, and I think for the most part, improvements
Just
to
have
the
to
existing.
measure it.
Yeah, we're not doubling the allowance or anything close to that. However, we did hear a couple of comments that in addition to the way the height is currently calculated, that there should also be an allowance or some exemption or flexibility where new builds could exceed the average height in the neighborhood. I think actually Councilor Vino may have mentioned this early on, but we also heard it in public session. So for example, that might say if the height limit is 11 meters, but your neighboring, and we would have to define exactly what we mean by neighboring. Is it directly adjacent? Is it within a block? Is it within a distance?
Whatever,
That it would essentially allow you to exceed the height limit by a set percentage. The thinking there is, I guess, to potentially fit into the context. It also could have to do with slopes, like sloping hills and that kind of thing. We didn't hear a lot of calls for it, but it also wasn't something we were coming out and
Does it make sense?
raising. I think it's a subjective, like it doesn't. It's not necessarily like a good or bad idea. I think it's pros and cons. Pros, you can give a little bit more flexibility in some circumstances and potentially help keep things looking uniform, so that you don't have, if you had an existing structure that was way above and then new ones had to stay way below. But I'm not sure that's the case in many places. It potentially would mean that heights over time could increase in local areas, because if there's no ultimate cap, 10%, and then another building 10%. You know, over decades, that could mean that particular areas did get taller, but that would be limited in some ways by the percentage. So I'm not necessarily recommending in favor of it, but I did want to bring it forward for discussion. It would be an extra layer to add to, I'm not saying our current calculations are complicated, but it would be an extra layer to add to what I think is a pretty good solution that we have in there as is.
Andre?
I like the as of right calculation. There are some cases that it would be nice if we had the flexibility by some sort of agreement, but put some parameters around it, like you can only move it whatever 10% or something like that, and you know you have to have like certain setbacks, and the topography is important. If you're at the top of the hill or if you're at the bottom of the hill,
Makes a difference.
it makes it, like if you're in the valley, then you're not going to obstruct anybody's view. If you're at the very top of the hill, you're not going to obstruct it. If you're anywhere in the middle, it could be a problem to your neighbors. So if you have decent setbacks and you have the right positioning within the village, it seems like something you might be able to consider potentially within some sort of
Guidelines.
yeah.
Right.
But beyond that, the as of right is probably okay. I think it's a good movement. Talked about for.
So you're recommending one or two?
I would say sort of one, but I mean, I'd like to see a proposal. It shouldn't be as of right. I think you need to put some criteria. I mean, overall, any time we're moving outside of the as of right, that there has to be a demonstration by the proponent that you're doing this in the keeping of the character of the village.
Yeah.
We could potentially look at offering that as a variance option with specific policy to speak to that.
That would be one good way.
And that way you would still have at least it wouldn't be as of right, it also wouldn't be putting someone through a development agreement to go, 3 feet higher or something.
I think about Sid Demeric's famous cupolas,
Yeah.
the building complies in every way, but he wants to put his cupola there, and he couldn't put it because it was 2 feet higher, but it wasn't blocking anybody's view, it was up on Highway 3. That would be an example where, I think that we could address that through a DA or some process and give him his cupola.
Go on development agreement, we've got to be simpler than that.
Variance of some sort.
Variance might be
Something, anything, but with constraints there so you don't end up with an apartment building next year that's looks like Middle Sackville again.
So is that complicated for you, Gareth?
No, we can work on some policy there and bring that back, absolutely. All right, so the next one is around heritage protection. So essentially the draft plan, it maintains the existing heritage protection program that's been in place since the early 90s. And mostly focuses on some of the architectural controls for new development that we've been talking about. The secondary plan does have a future project section, and in there is some I will say non-committal policy around the potential to investigate some future projects like a heritage conservation district or an expanded heritage registration program between this review and the next one. We did hear some comments that the plan doesn't go far enough in the protection of heritage, and some specific ideas that were expressed were around, so currently registered properties go through the Heritage Advisory Committee when they're making changes or renovations. There were some suggestions that properties adjacent to heritage properties should also be required to go through that process to ensure that they're not going to do something that takes away from the look and feel of their neighboring property. And then there was also some suggestions which I've seen also in other municipalities where registered heritage properties have some sort of incentives built into the land use bylaw. So it might be, for example, and some of these would not be land use bylaws, like tax incentives, but other things could be like allowing an additional dwelling unit in a heritage structure, requiring less on-site parking for heritage structures, those kind of things, in the hopes that incentivizes people to purchase those properties and keep them up and maintain them. So, looking at the options here, we could pursue an increased heritage registration program or heritage conservation district prior to completing the village plan review. That would obviously slow us way down. We could pursue the increased heritage registration or conservation district following the completion of the village plan review. And again, we'd add some policy to specify the intended actions for that work. And we'd want to have a discussion about which of those options we prefer. Do we want to expand our existing registration, or do we want to go that extra step to the really detailed conservation district? We could, like I said, come back with some ideas to implement incentives for registered properties, as we discussed, or we could leave things as they are here. Comments?
I don't agree with one, look at the others.
Yep.
Our Heritage Advisory Committee, that's a municipal wide, so would they be looking at this, or is there a...
So currently, and we are still trying to get that committee formed. We haven't had, unless, I don't think that.
Well, we did.
Oh, okay.
We have,
Fill the vacancy.
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
we had,
Oh, just yesterday. Okay.
yeah, we had some really good applications, and I don't know if people know who's been appointed to that.
I don't.
Yeah.
Great. No, but that's good.
They don't even know themselves that.
Yeah, right. It was just hot off the press.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, I'm quite excited about that. We had some good applications. And I'd like to see them take a look at it. I don't want to slow down this process, but I think heritage is important, and we now have
An actual committee.
an actual committee of really quality people, so. I don't want this process, we have to get them, it's been 15 years in the making, maybe we'll get it done, hold it up. 2 is good. I don't know which 2 or 3, I mean, one of those.
And we could do both
We do
2
both.
and 3. 3 would be more immediate, and in the plan, we'd actually say, if you have a registered property, you need less parking and those kind of things. And then 2 would be more to send that to the new committee and say, what do you folks think, and start that process.
Changes over time.
Yeah, that's right.
I like that.
That's actually a reasonable approach.
To me, like, maybe I think about it in terms of, like, we have a recreation committee, and, people that are pursuing certain recreational pursuits, the committee can, they have a budget for giving grant monies out for projects, for those endeavors. And I wonder, as part of this, if we could have a beautification component where if you can apply, if you're a registered property, you then apply to the committee for your project to access grant monies potentially or something.
Yeah.
Give the committee some ability to influence those projects.
I think that would be well received from our heritage property owners who often are, reaching out to ask when there's some minor provincial programs, but we currently don't have anything municipally. I suspect that would be a big incentive.
Yeah. Well, it's worth pursuing, but it's just the details
Yeah.
we have to.
So we can bring that to the new committee, sort of this whole, get them up to speed on the discussions on the heritage conservation districts, and then they of course make recommendations back to.
Well, I think the stigma that comes with that municipal heritage type control is that sometimes viewed as punitive. So you might be able to turn that around by having a reward-based system.
Yeah, absolutely. Great.
And that applies all across the municipality.
Yes, that's right. And yes, the new committee is, to your point, Councillor Balls, will apply to all projects across the municipality. Okay?
Because everybody on the committee doesn't live in the village, that's
Right.
why I was.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so expanded architectural controls. So, and what we're really talking about here is more the area that's covered by them, rather than earlier we talked about the specific architectural controls themselves. First bullet there, in addition to the comments on the specific regulations, we did also hear some questions, concerns, and comments about where different architectural controls apply or don't apply. We did, however, some of those comments, were sort of conflicting with other comments we heard where, there was things that density and development should be moved either onto Highway 3 or beyond Highway 3, but then there were also calls here to expand the heritage controls out to Highway 3, which don't necessarily conflict, but they potentially do. We also heard some specific comments that some of the new development where Queen Street meets Highway 3 is not in keeping with existing character, and there was surprise expressed that those currently are not covered under the existing architectural controls. They stop before those properties. So if we move on to the options here, and there is a little map, hopefully it's okay to see. So the green area is our sort of what used to be called our inner architectural control area. That's where the regulations we talked about earlier, the building heights, all of those things apply. In the brown or tan area outside, there's a lesser set of architectural controls, but significantly lesser. They still have a few provisions on varied massing and a few other things, but for the majority of the controls, they're in the green area. And so it's essentially there's a few properties south of Highway 3 that are in the brown area, and that's kind of what centered around some of this discussion. So some options here would be to consider expanding the area covered by the green area, the most stringent architectural controls, to include properties on both sides of Highway 3, for example, or to expand it to the entire village area would be another option. We could also look at creating, additional regulations either within the brown and the green, or create a new area if there, if we want to have a third or a fourth set of different rules for different areas. And then finally would be to make no changes. I think a couple of considerations is along Highway 3, that is where we have our new R4 zone proposed, where we are proposing to allow the small multi-unit buildings by right.
And the highway commercial zone.
That's right, and they do both of those zones, the R4 and the highway commercial. We've carried forward some of the provisions that used to be in the site plan approval criteria, that work that was done in 2011 to bring in the site plan approval area. And just as, I guess, a real brief synopsis, we felt by looking back that really a lot of the work that was done in there was good work. We weren't seeing a lot of development in that area. Anything that required site plan was people were actively working to avoid. People were sizing down projects or abandoning projects because they wanted to avoid that. And so what we did was we took what we hoped to be the most critical pieces out of that site plan and made those conditions to a development permit. So in effect, those are a type of architectural control. They're just in a different part of the document, which is what I mentioned earlier, that they're kind of scattered throughout. So those new multi-unit buildings have to have a percentage of the land landscaped for sort of beautification purposes. They have to have their parking at the side or the rear. So those are, in effect, architectural or site plan controls. We're just doing it through permit in this case. So if we were to expand the green area out, it would, potentially have some impacts on, on that. On some of those ideas that we've proposed for there. So it's,
I kind of like it the way it is.
Yeah, I do too, because architectural controls on food land and places like that.
it gets trickier when you're into sort of corporate.
Complex,
And even the discussions we had in the last number of years on signage, sorry,
No, I would comment that, in general, I like it where it is, but I think that maybe we just missed a few spots. Like there are, even though our plan is to have a different type of housing and the like on the other side of the number 3, which may have different architectural requirements and wouldn't maybe conform exactly to what we would allow within that green area. Mm-hmm. There are some places, like if you think about as you go out Valley Road and you turn up towards Mary's Cove, there are houses in that area that aren't controlled architecturally, and I think there's a number of properties that maybe just fall just outside of our controlled area that I just feel like maybe we could make some subtle adjustments there and grab up some of the ones that probably need a bit of control and that really belong with what I would call that core village architectural, and then some are clearly more commercial as you move up past the Irving and all that stuff. Like I can see that doesn't, obviously you're not going to regulate Tim Hortons and and all that sort of stuff, in the same way that you would regulate something on the Chester Peninsula.
No, I can see how that slight tweaking, but it can't get into the highway commercial and stuff like that.
And the highway commercial breaks off in that area, I think.
Also,
Right.
Take Haddon Hill for example. Haddon Hill is partially in the village.
And
Most of
partially
it is not.
Yeah.
So I think they need to be the same. Just an artificial line
Yeah.
from that perspective.
So we could, I think, Councilor Vino, you're essentially talking about the area between sort of the Victoria and maybe Duke, or maybe not, maybe Peterson Drive or something like the Independent, that section, and that is where these new developments receive the criticism, just
He was coming down Valley and turning left.
Sort of.
Right.
Yeah. No, but I think you're right.
That sort of
There's like a little section right in there where there's a bunch of properties that really belong to the village, not.
From the old train
outside the-
station up to the Commons Road.
Yeah, and I think we'd have to almost go property by property and really think and look at them, and then that line maybe not as crisp and straight as what it shows in the map. Maybe it's a little bit more, whatever it has to be, but I'd like to see maybe a bit
Yeah,
of a
when
closer
they're
look
back
at
in
those.
feet or something, you know.
Because the one, the property,
I get it a little bit.
that the vexatious property is just on the other side of that green
Yeah,
line.
that's right.
But
Literally, yeah.
I think when you're in the village and you're walking along, you don't feel like you're leaving the village.
Right.
When you see it, it's right there.
And
And,
are you leaving the village?
wow.
Yeah.
You're
The slight
leaving the
variation in
control
the
area.
line on the number 3.
Village has defined
When they
boundaries.
made those changes,
We don't have control of
people
those defined boundaries.
that we're talking about could have actually been involved in the plan review. Because they're gonna be subject to all these rules and guidelines and had no opportunity to take part in the meetings or not knowing that they were part of that. So I see this as a little late.
It is, but we are gonna go back out once we have a new document.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah,
I want a voice if I was one of those other
well,
outside
We
areas.
may have
if
to,
we end up extending it out, maybe we gotta put a flyer on every door.
So we're not gonna move the area in this review, right? We have to define boundaries that we're dealing with.
yeah.
That's all we can deal with.
Why?
Well, it's only the village, yes.
This is what this is.
Yeah.
We're talking about like going 1,000 feet across from the number 3, and that's very small area. I'm just saying they apply here.
Right, this would be to expand the green.
I understand.
Okay. Yeah, okay, so no, we can take a look at that and
I can look at it one or two, I mean, and maybe we need to go for a walk and to see which houses we're talking about.
yeah, absolutely, that
Well,
may be.
there may be some
Walking
there
snow.
that have, are there any there that are commercial? And then you're suggesting, that we're,
Well, Andre initially was talking about turning left on Valley, now we're talking about turning right on Valley and turning right on,
Just up to like the Commons.
I don't wanna get
Road,
stuck on the
virtually
geography.
is nothing commercial.
And in the end of the day, I
It's
guess,
all housing.
the suggestion here is potentially we may have missed some properties that really deserve control, that belong with the village, and they're just a little bit outside the control line, and those properties, what we're hearing here in the feedback is that some of the recent changes are vexatious.
but was that feedback from one person? I didn't hear a groundswell.
I didn't.
But yeah, no, I wouldn't say it
I
was.
heard some groundswells, that wasn't one of them.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I don't necessarily want to say it was just one person, but you're right. It wasn't one of the primary considerations. There was just, it was mostly, honestly, it was mostly around those new buildings that are being developed. And then when it was expressed that, those are outside of the architectural area, people were saying, I didn't realize that. Maybe it should be expanded.
So you're talking about the ones on Queen.
Yes, yeah. I try not to get specific.
Gotcha.
Yeah, those are the, yeah.
Some people like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And
So
that
what do
was.
we want to do? We gotta give them some rest.
So I think right now, based on what I'm hearing, we take a look to slightly revise that boundary line between the green and the brown, but not drastically change it.
Very minor change.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
Move on.
Great. Okay. So we are getting there definitely.
I hope so.
The next one here is the extent of the core commercial zone. This is around Queen and Union Street. This was this was a single person who made this point. This area has been zoned commercial for since the existing plan and the previous plan, so it's been zoned commercial for a long time. It is the properties in the black box here is just a rough idea, but essentially the sentiment was that because of some of the changes in the core commercial zone, we do allow multi-unit residential buildings by development agreement, that this area of Queen and Union would be more appropriate as the R2 zone. The person who requested this was not a property owner within this area, but they were within the area circled in black, but they were a neighboring property. They're nearby. They're in the area, but not in the subject area, I guess. Like I said, it was a single one, and the request was generally, the person who submitted the comment didn't draw this line. I did this just as a rough representation. If you look at King Street, essentially that's what they're looking for, is something like that, where somewhere's mid-block the zoning changes from commercial to residential 2. In terms of the options here, it really is, do we want to make any changes to the extent of the commercial zone in that area?
Then you're starting the spot zone.
Yeah, we haven't, and that would be, I would think, if we were going to consider this, we might want to reach out to some of those property owners, to Councillor Shapford's point on the previous one, to see what they thought. Or we may just want to leave it as is. That's also, like I said, this, not to diminish any individuals, but this was just a single person's comments, and it is an established commercial area.
I leave
Leave it as is.
There we go.
All right. Next one. This one is, I think, an interesting one in terms of discussion and debate, but an important one. So the corner vision triangle, just as a quick reminder, this is essentially at every intersection, we'd be measuring back 20 feet along each street and then drawing a diagonal line to create a triangle. And within that triangle, vegetation is proposed to need to be kept basically to about 2 feet in height cut. And that's so that you can see at intersections clearly, and to hopefully improve safety around many of the intersections we have here in the village. So there were some really good questions raised. So for example, what about existing structures? How does that work? Are we requiring people to remove buildings? And that's not the intent. But what about vegetation? What about trees versus shrubs versus weeds, those kind of things? And then we also heard some questions on how is that going to be enforced? Will it go through our normal bylaw process, which presumably without any different direction it would just go through our normal bylaw process. So
bylaw enforcement process.
Yes, that's right. Yes, yeah. So whether it's complaint driven or whether we're actively going out, those kind of things.
We notice it ourselves. Or we
right. So this is one actually where make no changes is not an option, because I do need direction from council on this, and want to have a full discussion on this. So
you're going to have to allow rebuild in the event.
Pardon me?
You're going to have to allow rebuilds in the same envelope. Right?
And that question actually just came up recently, and I again mistakenly I didn't intend to, but at the meetings what I was saying was existing structures would be grandfathered or allowed to maintain. And what I've said on the slides here was that existing structures would be allowed to stay until they needed to be rebuilt. And that's a discussion for council. So I didn't intentionally change that wording, but there is a big difference there between whether you're good forever or you're only good until it burns or you decide you're tearing it down to rebuild. So what I'm looking for here is clarification on what kind of vegetation we want it to apply to and how we want it to work with structures. So we could, for example, say that it's all vegetation, regardless of what it is, that it needs to be cut down. We could also say that trees beyond a certain diameter, caliper is what it's called, would be exempt. So whether there's concern around having people remove mature trees from these areas. So in terms of vegetation, we would kind of want to know, are we talking across the board all vegetation, or are we having exemptions for established trees? And again, we would define
We're
that.
trying to establish sight lines for safety. Is
Yes,
that correct?
that's the intent of the corner vision.
We also said to people at the meetings, I think we did, suggested anyway, that we're not gonna make you cut your tree down.
You just
If the
can't
tree-
put
If the
in
tree
trees.
blows down, you probably won't want a new tree there.
So those are the
Yeah, but
The
if your
specifics.
house burns down, you're gonna be able to rebuild your house, because otherwise, you can't do anything. Many of these cases are undersized lots.
And they may not be able to meet any
Right,
of their setback requirements and things like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I think particularly on the structures, my suggestion there would be to say that main buildings are exempt.
Exempt.
If they're existing in that area, they could be rebuilt if they're burnt down. But say an accessory structure, if it was burnt or demolished, couldn't be rebuilt within that
Block of
triangle.
years.
I think on structures, I think that's a fair place to
Well, yeah, 'cause you can
stand.
put people out of housing.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And we don't want to make somebody, if they had
But if they could put up their main building, why couldn't they put up their outbuildings?
it's a balance between safety and property rights and existing structures. Do you want to let some,
Yeah, that structure is in that sight line.
yes, yeah, we're only talking about within that triangle, yeah. So that's where I think, to your point, I think
I get you.
we want to, even something like the Bank of Nova Scotia, would we really, if they needed to rebuild, would we really be saying you need to cut it back from the corner? Probably not, but if it was a shed or another kind of accessory structure that,
Downtown, almost every corner has that.
exactly,
A lot
yeah.
of those are undersized.
That's right. So I think that's where the main
And
balance.
Yeah, you're talking about a triangle.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any provincial regulations for safety up? Because all of the highways in the village
Right.
are provincial.
Yeah,
So what guidelines do they use?
I'm not aware of anything that they have. If there is, certainly it's not being implemented when you look around.
All
There's
existing structures.
there's lots of vegetation that's right to the,
Oh, my observation, most of this vegetation you're talking about is actually on highway property.
Yeah.
it may be.
Planted and maintained by the adjacent property owner.
It doesn't belong to them.
How would we control trees and bushes growing on the highway right away?
That's why, yeah.
So yeah, that's a good question. I think we probably we'd start, so there's gonna be a few cases here. So I think we'd start with a discussion with Public Works as they work with Department of Transportation regularly on those kind of things. I would hope that we would not need to have, like we do with our universal signage bylaw, some sort of special bylaw to let us cut trees down. Hopefully we could either report it to them or we could do it on their behalf, but I don't know.
You could have a discussion, but from my experience, they're not much interested.
Well, I would also, so it's a good question. Most other municipalities do have corner vision triangle regulations, but many of those are towns and cities that have their own traffic authority. So I think if council is, if council thinks this is a good idea, we'll do our best efforts to work with the province to have it. So, and if it's impossible, we'll come back and let you know that we.
I can see a new structure, it's easy.
Yeah.
You just don't let them do it. But I don't know how you deal with the old stuff.
New structure, you're gonna have to let the new structure be rebuilt in that same footprint.
No, what I mean, like if it's a brand.
Like a vacant lot.
Yeah, vacant lot.
That's
Yeah,
different.
yeah.
Or they don't already have trees planted, so you can't
Right.
plant them.
Yeah, and it is, those trees are some, so again, we can have these, different categories. So existing structures are permitted to be rebuilt.
Yeah.
Accessory structures are allowed to stay until they're at the end of their life and then they can't be rebuilt.
Yeah.
We could do the same with trees and say that existing trees beyond a certain dimension are allowed to stay until they blow down or need to be cut down. And then all other vegetation has to be kept, mowed or whatever.
Yeah, and if it's new, you're not allowed to plant out here.
Right,
Either.
that's right, yeah.
Get that.
But admittedly, I'm sure this is going to cause some, some concern and complaints from people because to the point that have been made here, many of those right-of-ways blend in, landscaping blends between private and public property.
I'll bet you 90% of it is all Department of Highways land.
Right.
Yes, under.
So, right now it applies to a 20-foot setback from the corner of the property. But the problem we're trying to overcome is that we don't have clear sight lines from the traveled surface
Right.
Can we make the setback from the traveled surface instead?
We could do that,
It
yeah.
seems like that would be,
That would soften it.
that would actually make it better for everybody and give
Yeah.
more allowance for the lots and frankly, that's what we're trying to overcome.
Right, so measure from the traveled surface, the pavement
To
or
me, it
whatever.
doesn't matter where the property line is, it matters where your cars park.
Right, yeah.
Yeah,
That's-
that's, yeah, that's what we're trying not to block.
Right, yeah, and that would have less impact on private property because, yeah, it would, presumably for safety, it would still accomplish the same thing.
So if we said that and
Yep.
exempted existing houses and
Yep.
things like that.
Existing, yeah, so we'd say exempt existing homes entirely, accessory structures and large trees are permitted to remain until their end of life or need to be redone. And then all other vegetation needs to be kept to that,
From the
Some sort of
highway, right?
7.75 meters. Okay, great, yeah, that's great.
Next.
Alrighty. So this is another kind of one-off. So this is, we're talking about the former Hobble property. I think everybody's familiar with what I mean by that at the intersection of Victoria and Highway 3. So there's a collection of small lots there, totaling about 1.86 acres, adjacent to the Old Stone Bridge, with frontage on Highway 3, but a significant drop to the property. So the lot has been previously zoned highway commercial, and is currently proposed to be the residential 4 zone in the new plan, as basically all the lots along Highway 3 there are. We did hear comments at a number of sessions that basically this lot is low-lying and may not be suitable for really any sort of significant development, be it commercial or residential. There's also questions around access to the site and that kind of thing.
That kind of floods.
Right, and that was the primary concern, was around flooding. So it was suggested that that lot may be more appropriately zoned as say a parks and open space zone or something like that. That would be a.
We don't own it.
That's right. So.
Is this from the owner request?
No, this is not. This is from the public.
If you did, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean it is within council's authority to do so, but yes, that's right. We haven't heard from the owner directly on that one. So we could leave it. We could try to reach out to the owner, or we could just.
I think you should reach out to the owner.
Yeah, me too, because
If there's a desire to
if
pursue it. Yeah.
if we zoned it that way, it's virtually worthless to
That's right.
And you can't just do that to people without some kind of discussion.
Right. Okay. So yeah, we can reach out and see if there is an interest, and if there is, we'll pursue it. And if there's, I just want to ensure if the owner's not interested, we would leave it as is.
We'll just come back and
For
tell
now.
us.
Okay. Sure. Yeah.
You might want to fill it in and go purpose.
Great. Alrighty.
He's got to do it with it anyway.
All right, we've got another kind of one-off here. So this is a request from the owner of the property so what we're talking about here is the identified PID with the black text. The zoning that is included here is the current zoning. So currently this lot, so that's the independent is Civic 211 and then Peterson Drive in the middle. It's actually really that area that we were talking about. The architectural controls don't quite go all the way to Highway 3. So currently that lot is split zone, so the teal or green is highway commercial and the back portion is Central Village residential. And then as you'll notice too, the two properties west are also zoned highway commercial currently. In the proposed draft plan, I had proposed to rezone those 3 lots we're talking about all to R4. And so basically the independent was the end of the highway commercial zone.
Yeah.
So the owner of this PID approached me and submitted, there's written correspondence to verify that, and basically requested that it be essentially maintained, but rather than split zone, be fully zoned highway commercial. He has stated that he has plans to develop the lot.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, so that's that one. And so then in terms of options with what we do with this, we could rezone the select PID only so that it's fully highway commercial, which would be that was what the request of the owner was. Or we could consider, I guess, in addition to that, then there's the consideration of the 2 properties to the west. So do we want to leave those R4 as they were in the draft plan, or do we want to mirror what's in the current plan and keep the highway commercial zone on those?
What are on 208 and 212?
That's right.
What's on that? Are they vacant lots?
No, they're houses at the moment.
trying to get my head around what
Yeah.
I said.
So basically, I guess the considerations here would be if, and I'm understanding we want to grant the request of the applicant. If we didn't grant the request of the applicant, the Peterson Drive would kind of become the new de facto boundary between highway commercial and the residential area. If we accept the request of the applicant and rezone only his lot, then we've got this sort of half a block, which is not to say it's a bad thing, but the boundary's there, or we can mirror what's there currently and extend that highway commercial to the two properties to the west, and you'll effectively have what you have there, except the subject pit will be all green instead of split zoned. So it's,
So Garth, do we have a lot of PIDs that are in split zones?
not too many. I mean, they do happen for a variety of reasons in different places, but no, I'm not sure exactly why. I suspect this was kind of to just make a kind of a clean line between the second property to the west and cutting it across. So I think definitely having that lot zoned one zone or another is a good thing. Remove the split zone, and what I'm hearing is we'll make that one highway commercial, so then it's really just the two to the west. Do we want to
Do them.
leave them as is, which is highway commercial, or change those into residential?
I'm just curious, the number 15, is that where the new home is going? The Bonnie Lee Farm new?
I think so.
Yes.
It's nearby, if it's not that specific
No, just
lot.
below it. one below.
Maybe one south, the one that's cut off.
Well, I'm just thinking, if that's approved highway commercial, could be quite they could look out and look at a block.
Right, we don't know what commercial use is
Well-
proposed there. Yeah, that's right.
That's my own,
There,
we don't have enough information.
I
just-
don't like lots that are split zone. I think one or the other. I do what the property owners asked and then make it all commercial.
and just to Councillor Church's point, there is a provision in the highway commercial zone for abutting zone requirements. So where the highway commercial zone abuts a residential or institutionally zoned lot, so in this case it's residential, there's an increase of the setback in the rear yard to 6 meters. You're not able to store goods in the rear yard, in the abutting yard. There's a 6 meter setback for parking, so you can't have the parking right up against the residential property. And there also has to be maintenance of a vegetated buffer between the two, kind of like what's between Tim Hortons and Shoreham now.
Okay, because I'm thinking, you could look at a wall.
Right. So there's that consideration is there, but I think your point is still valid to consider whether that's appropriate or not.
I like this in the topography. The split zone lot is actually on the flat
True.
with all the rest of the commercial, and then when you start down the hill, then you see the other two lots there. To me, there's I don't know, it feels like you're entering another area. I have no problem making those two lots residential as they are now. And
Yeah, that's 208 and 212.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was in the initial
Proposal
proposal.
just to make those R4. That's
No.
right. Yeah. Okay. So we'll take.
Okay with that.
So we'll rezone the whole lot at the request of the owner to highway commercial and leave the other two to the west
Leave the
as
other ones
residential.
residential.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Alrighty. Okay. That is all of what we heard from the public. So there are now a couple of items that I've called staff identified issues. So these are kind of just questions that we came up with as we were going through this and having all of these discussions. So the first one is, so in our, just again as a quick reminder, in our core commercial zone, we have a requirement that the 50% of the ground floor area and 80% of the building frontage has to be occupied by a commercial use. The question has come up is we are now in the commercial zone, we're considering, well, in the commercial zones, we call short-term rentals tourist accommodations, just like hotels.
Yeah.
And so a question that's come up, and the little image here is supposed to represent this, is whether or not a tourist accommodation should count as that commercial use at the ground floor and at the storefront. So the initial intent behind that commercial use at the ground floor is to keep, like we have on Pleasant Street, window shopping. You've got storefronts that address the street that aren't closed and seeming private. They're built right to the sidewalk, that kind of thing. So that's the intent behind that provision. But then what we thought was a good question came up was, well, a short-term rental, we're calling it in the commercial zone, that's a tourist accommodation, that's a commercial use. But it's kind of like a residential use. So should that count for that? And so the image here, basically what we're talking about is this is supposed to represent the building, and so the requirement is that the front piece be commercial. But should we allow the tourist accommodation to count as that, or should we have
part of the commercial?
Right, or should we have a special clause in there to say commercial use at ground floor, not including short-term rental use, that kind of thing. And this is, I think it's an interesting one to talk about.
Well, short-term rental is not exactly what I call trying to achieve the commercial stuff.
Right, yeah.
We're trying to limit that, so I don't think we should include it.
Right, okay. Yep, so, okay, if that's the consensus, we'll say that short-term rentals do not count as the commercial use on ground floor. Great.
No, it's not one. Yeah, doesn't hurt. Yeah, you gotta take it. Yeah.
So the next one was, again, just a bit of a realization as we got into it and question. So like I said, the parking exemption, the on-site parking exemption in the core commercial zone was well received at the meetings. And so we had wondered whether there would be a desire to consider extending that. As it's currently drafted, it does not apply to residential uses. So commercial uses don't have to, like a restaurant or a store doesn't have to provide on-site parking, but an apartment building would. And the thinking there is that those residential parkers are there every night. They're there for 8 hours or more, and that's why it should be. Some of the reason we might not want to do that, and one specific example that I came up with is, in that zone, we would allow, just for an example, up to a 10-unit building residential, but we would also allow a 10-unit building of tourist accommodations, which would be those short-term rental units. The interesting piece here is, so if we're looking at two identical 10-unit buildings, they have residential uses, except one is long-term tenants and one is short-term tenants operated for profit. The way things are drafted now with that parking exemption, the short-term rental building would not have to provide on-site parking, but the 10-unit residential building would have to provide 10 on-site parking spaces. And so it almost disincentivizes creating residential units in that zone. So the consideration would be, do we want to just say, you know what, in the core commercial zone, there's no on-site parking requirements across the board. That would, for that specific example, it would make that more equitable. There potentially could be implications to that.
They'll all be parked in the street.
Now some developers will still create parking because it's part of how they market the unit, and some won't, and so we'll leave it to the market to decide.
If we went halfway instead of 10-5.
Yeah, we could half it for residential. That absolutely, that's certainly
I can't see if you're going to live there all the time. People are going to have cars. I mean, they have to go someplace.
Yeah. So you're right. There's any sort of in between option as well. Say half the requirement to what we do now, or.
Well, I wouldn't eliminate it completely, or else you just know they're going to be in the street, and then there was no worse for anybody who's going down to the stores and stuff to park.
Yeah.
So I don't see that working.
I don't either, I agree. Have to have some type of parking.
Yeah. I think cutting it in half is better than getting rid of it
What do
altogether.
you think it should be?
It's a tricky one. I mean, there is definitely a trend in planning to remove parking requirements. Town of Lunenburg did it across the board, but
Because there's no space.
it's still to be determined the results of that. Yeah,
If you go
and
there, you can see it's a failure.
You can't get a parking spot. I went there
There's nowhere to park.
to go
Right.
on the balloon house,
Mhm.
and I almost had to park out by Tim Hortons
Right.
as you come into town by the grocery store. There was no parking.
And particularly, I think if that's not supported by like a really good parking plan and enforcement and all those other things that municipal parking areas that we may or may not want to even venture into, then I agree. I think it shouldn't be done in a vacuum. If we're going to commit to that, we'd want to look at all the other implications and what other solutions we might offer. So,
Well, we can't incentivize short-term rentals over long-term housing. So.
No.
right. So I guess there'd be just
That's
thinking.
why I'm suggesting the compromise.
We could say that the residential rate is halved in that zone. We could also have a specific language to say that tourist accommodations do require on-site parking. That would, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of other options, but maybe the half would be, you know.
Half, and they can apply to them too.
Yep.
I mean, you gotta park someplace.
Okay.
Someday in the future, maybe the municipality needs to seek out some land and try to create a lot or something.
Yeah. I just don't know quite where. Well, the ferry work into a parking lot.
Yeah, but it's an ongoing
Anyway.
complaint.
The next one, and it really kind of ties back in a way to the first item we talked about, which is the water, is whether there's any desire or whether council is ready to, because I know there's ongoing work that hasn't fully come back yet on potential water sources, but whether language and policy should be added to the secondary plan to essentially, and this could be worded in a variety of ways, from very committal to less so, whether council intends to undertake, an aquifer study or commit to providing central water over the life of this plan. It doesn't need to be there, but when we were in those first couple meetings, we were just getting hammered about water, and so this was something I said as a potential compromise could be, but there's either a commitment or at least the intent of committing to it, and that.
I don't think we can commit to it.
Right.
Because we don't even know whether we have a water source.
Yeah.
You gotta determine all that.
Right.
It's a long-term
Yeah.
event. We'll be doing the next study.
Right, and so currently as it's drafted, that's essentially what the most of the policy says, is in the short to medium term, there's no expectation
Do
of
we
central water,
understand
so
the
we have to
problem? Yes.
proceed.
Are we trying to find options to resolve it? Yes. Can we commit to it?
Right.
At this moment, I don't know how you could.
Can you commit to a study?
We're already in the process of looking at it.
I know, but we haven't committed to a study.
We could, that would potentially be, one other option would be or the other option, I guess, would be to, look at a groundwater study, and then even if, let's say there is no plan to do central water in 10 years, by the time we're at the next plan review, if we did have a better understanding, a scientific understanding of what's in the ground where, we could zone and prioritize development
Well, that would be
based on
useful.
that too.
I'll grant you that.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of the issue with the water shortage may be just that, the well's not deep enough.
Right,
You know,
and
I mean,
that's
A
where,
groundwater study would be useful.
groundwater,
It would
I mean,
be.
if your option is central water because you have no water, but the reason you have no water is because your well is dry because it's not deep enough, that's a whole different question.
right. And that would, I think, help us get to that determination. If we said, oh, you're in an area with good water, how deep is your well? Oh, well,
Yes,
it actually shows that the aquifer's at such
So
and
if you
such.
could put some general.
Yeah.
Yeah,
basic
so maybe we
wording
can work
about the
towards,
groundwater.
investigate the study side of things.
But I thought we already did a lot of that work. People were questioning what type of well they had, remember when we were.
I
That
don't
was
remember.
my understanding, and Public Works may be able to speak better, but that was a survey of well users.
As opposed to an analysis of availability.
Right. And frankly, I don't know, and Councilor Bino may or may not be able to speak more to what would be involved in that type of study. I'm not sure if that, and there's probably a range of scopes, from actually drilling to doing tabletop based on the geology and existing. There is some databases of well data that the province maintains, so that could probably be reviewed, but much of that is pretty old, and so it's a challenge.
Yeah, committing to explore, and I think it's a
Yep.
broader conversation that has so many implications that we can't,
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we'll add some language in there that will look to investigate options on groundwater studies. Yeah,
Well, we've tried twice in the village to get consensus.
Yeah, it's
Didn't
not
get it,
easy.
we're not likely to get it. I think we're more likely to get it outside. We start some development out there, and I'd like to see that as part of the study, but groundwater study definitely is necessary.
There have been many plebiscites over the years in many different jurisdictions for a wide range of issues that pertain to land use. How many of them have been successful, actually had the population come back and been in favor of the proposed infrastructure? Zero. This kind of infrastructure can never be put in place if we require a positive plebiscite. Because in general, people don't think beyond their own need. Most people don't plan a community when they're responding to a plebiscite. They're thinking about their own need, you know?
In their own pocket, to some extent.
Of course. So if you think, for example, of bringing sewer to an area where people have septics already, those people with septics don't need anything. But future generations won't look back and say, you know, I'm so disappointed our grandfathers and mothers put this in place for us. They won't do that. So it takes leadership and to push on and put infrastructure in place. We can't do it if we expect a positive result from a plebiscite. We'll never get there. We have to decide that this is something we want for future generation and do it. And there will be people that will be opposed, of course.
55%.
Okay, so you got,
Because that doesn't help them with their immediate need, but
Yes.
we have to think about their children and their children's children.
Agree with you 100%. Let's do it.
okay, what's your next one there?
Okay, and I apologize, I'm late. There's one here that I didn't actually include on here. It just came up recently, and this is, so currently in the plan, we have a history that we don't generally regulate or issue permits for retaining walls. It's not something that we've traditionally done. We've said that's a minor accessory structure and not subject to a development permit. Over the summer, there have been a few cases and a couple of areas where we, as staff, thought we should at least bring it to the table to discuss whether or not, either in particularly identified areas such as, you know, steep slopes, or across the board, that we would want to start to issue permits for retaining walls. In particular, and you probably are all aware, like the Walker Road area, we had the slides that occurred with the heavy rains, and there have been some concerns that because currently we don't regulate retaining walls, that work can take place without any sort of municipal approval. Now, if somebody's building a structure in an area that they've carved out to retain, building code will pick that up and they can call for geotechnical work to ensure that it's secure and there's not going to be an issue. But if it was done, for example, in the creation of a parking area or something that wasn't related to building code, our development staff don't have the ability to regulate that. And so the concern would be, probably particularly in those certain areas, is there, you know, a public hazard being created through this unregulated work. So a couple of options there. We could look at, you know, slope maps and try to identify, put a map together of these areas are the areas within which we do control retaining walls, require permits, and therefore you're going to need a geotechnical study. You know, we could also say across the board we require permits and we'll only require the studies when it's deemed necessary. We could have some criteria around that. We could require permits for retaining walls above a certain height, so like minor ones of only a couple feet maybe we don't get into, but then if you're into something that's 5-6 feet or more, then we do. So there's a whole variety of options, and but we did want to identify that because it is a land use issue, and we have had, you know, well, one was caused by the slide, one was caused by the explosives that were found, but 2 evacuations in the recent history there, which was, and so it did feel like something we should at least bring forward as part of this this discussion. And that's brand new, so I apologize that hasn't been discussed in the past.
In HRM, retaining walls above 1 meter will require engineering because potentially they can be built poorly and they become a safety hazard. I'm not sure if that, you know, that seems kind of low, but, you know, we may wish to look at walls above like whatever, 1.5 meters or something like that, because, you know, oftentimes is in the Chester vernacular, we have boulder walls and things like that. And we're very fortunate we have some very good tradesmen here that build very good walls, but we may not always have the same quality of tradesmen that build those walls, and it could pose, if it's along a boundary line or something, it could pose a significant risk of kids climbing them and that's what, so.
Good point. Yeah.
To some degree, yeah, just a question of what height we start at, what the circumstances.
I think 1 meter is kind of low personally.
Yeah, it is.
But I'd love a staff recommendation maybe.
Sure, okay, we can bring that back, look at something above 1 meter is the,
Yeah.
great.
Okay, where are we now, Gareth?
We are very close. So the next
We got a
one's,
lot left on the agenda, that's all I'm saying.
yeah, so the next ones are essentially what I've called other related feedback and comments, and we can go through these as quickly as we like. Essentially, these were just things that were heard that, it's not that they don't relate to the plan review, but they don't directly, or they're not addressed completely within the plan review. And I suspect some of these may lead into the sort of the last discussion that we want to have anyways on potential, next steps. So the first one was around the process and timeline. Unfortunately, this is not uncommon when we do engagement. Despite our best efforts, we heard that there was not enough notice of the meetings or direct notice to no individual mailouts. It was expressed that the timeline was being rushed and pushed ahead, and that may have been because we had some target dates on there by completing it by the calendar year of 2023. I'm not sure if that was what the concerns were, but I think as evidenced here, we expected to do this in September. We're almost into November, so we're taking the time to do what we need to do and go back through it. It was expressed that more independent studies and outside professionals should be brought in to review the plan. That's a point. It's not something that would normally be done. We did have expert consultants and legal review and our accessibility coordinator, so we have had lots of reviews, but that was expressed. So that's that. The next one was around bylaw enforcement, and this was LUB, but also just others. So, and I'm sure some of these are not new things that we're hearing here. So, unhappiness with the current complaint-driven system, expressed that things aren't being enforced. What's the point of having rules? There were lots of specific examples of alleged violations that were given, and basically that the current enforcement is not preventing future issues from popping up through the complaint-driven process. We also heard some concerns and complaints around street infrastructure, that any new density would already worsen a bad situation, and that the streets are undersized and overused. And generally that was understood that those are mostly J-class roads where we only have an element of that, but those concerns were still expressed. Second to last here, climate change. So we heard that the plan lacks ambition or responds inadequately to climate change. Specific examples that were given was the lack of setbacks and protection for ocean properties. There were significant concerns expressed that the Chester wastewater treatment plant is currently not functioning properly, and that it definitely couldn't be expanded and still meet requirements. That was expressed. That the effects of climate change will worsen the existing groundwater situation, and so all the more reason to look at the water issue. The last one that I have is probably either number one or number two in terms of what we heard at the public sessions, and this has to do with the hotel that's been proposed on Valley Road. We did clarify that development was already approved under the existing plan, and that going forward, all new hotels will require a development agreement. So in my mind, as the planner who's responsible for policy, we have addressed that issue as fully as we can. There were calls that MOC should pull the permits that had been issued for the hotel and should take the developer to court to stop that. It was unclear on how that would be effective.
He'd be the one taking us to court, did it?
Yeah, we'd lose. There was comments that MOC should pressure the developer to make changes to the design and the unit numbers. There was a question that if the draft plan had been in place, would the hotel have been approved? And so the answer to that is not a yes or no. It may well have been, but it would go through a totally different process and have public meetings and engagement. We would have more ability to negotiate with the developer on some of those aspects. There was one opposing comment that the hotel is a great project and sorely needed in the village. There was disbelief that the municipality would approve the development without a detailed water study being submitted. Some of those things were submitted as part of the development permit application. That doesn't mean they're public, so we can't just choose what we share. Questions as to why the hotel was approved without a public hearing, neighbor notice, or other engagement. And again, that's down to the fact that it was done through as of right. Yeah.
In place.
Now these are the next steps. This was assuming we got direction on everything today and that council was satisfied with things, with today's changes.
There's a couple of things at the beginning that
yes.
didn't give you good direction.
So we can go back to those if we'd like.
Well, that's where we need to be. Then the next step is bring us the new draft and and we go take it to the public again.
Sure.
I would assume.
So, yeah, so that was really, it was around the decisions on the R1 zone, what we're gonna do there, and then also sort of the first slide, which was the potable water density, whether we wanna eliminate 2-unit dwellings and accessory dwelling units, those kind of things.
So the first one was like Chester Peninsula and stuff, or are we just gonna leave it alone?
Yeah, that's this one here, the R1 minimum lot size. So just one more slide onto the options. So essentially, yeah, so what we have here is like option 1 would be to put the lot size, the minimum lot size back to what it was, put the setbacks back to what they were, but keep the new provisions to limit the footprint of buildings. And also we have a lot coverage provision. So those are around architectural controls to preserve the character. Option 2 would be to revert the lot size and the yard setbacks and also remove the new provisions on minimum footprint or maximum footprint. And again, we can select several of these if we like. Option 3 would be to Councillor Wells' point, there are some lots that are well undersized, not so much on the peninsulas, but in other areas. So we could do a review of those undersized lots and see which ones might make sense to switch to the R2 zone where they would better be in conformance and compliance. We could, as mentioned, we could have in the R1 zone, we could have different standards depending on whether or not you have access to the sewer system. And so that would allow for change over time. If the sewer was expanded, lots that were connected would then be subject to different regulations. We could also try to propose a new minimum lot size somewhere between the previous and what we proposed here, or we could make no changes. So there's a lot of potential options there. Yeah, it'd be great.
What we heard from the public was they don't want any change.
Yeah, and so I think option 1 or 2, there wasn't a significant amount of discussion on the footprint sizes. Like it was mostly around the lot sizes and the setbacks and the ability to subdivide into 4 and those kind of things.
The one I heard.
Right. So I think options 1 or 2 would be there. I think option 1 would be my recommendation. Again, that's based on the architectural pieces about the the maximum footprint, because there have been some very large buildings built in that zone lately that did receive pushback as this is out of keeping because it's too big. And so this would put an upper limit on.
So option 1 would be close to do nothing, but
right,
allow us a little bit.
Those 2 new ones.
Over the size.
Right.
And I wanted to look at maybe reducing somewhat those setbacks.
You want less of a setback.
I know what Councillor Vino said about service, no service. Having said that, I'm still in favor of leaving it the same in
Me too.
Knott's Point, Peninsula, and Simons Point. But there is an area in the old estate residential that doesn't fit any of those 3 categories around Victoria.
Right.
We're taking those out and putting them in R2.
There's also a section up near Pig Loop that's in a similar situation.
Yeah.
Very small lots.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would be sort of option. That would include at least option 3 to review some of those.
Yeah, okay.
Leave it alone, plus
Right.
review
We could
that.
take.
But there are some areas that really didn't fit in the estate residential zone.
Right.
And we want to fix that,
Yes. Yeah.
What do we want to do?
just like we just said.
Oh, yeah, I'm fine with it.
So is that option 1 and 3? So we'll go back to the minimum
Yes.
lot size and the 25-foot setbacks, but we'll keep the maximum footprint and lot coverage.
Yeah.
And then we'll also look at which zone or which properties may not fit that are not on the peninsulas, and that'll come back, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
What's your next one you need settled?
And there may be, it was really, so it's just one up, sorry. This was on the potable water density, so this was whether there was a desire to pull out any of those things like the 2-unit dwellings or the accessory dwelling units to lower the impact of new units in the new plan.
How are you there?
Yeah, most of them
We're
are,
talking
the
about
majority.
100 liters a day.
The majority
I
are.
think we want to leave it.
Number 5.
Is that fake?
Leave it alone.
Problem.
Okay, great.
What else?
I think that is everything. Other than, in in my original proposed next steps, what I had suggested was I would take the feedback from today. I would also take so Sam has also done a legal review of the draft and given me a good number of comments to go through. And then I also have some comments from Ellen on accessibility of the document and that kind of thing. So my plan would be to go through all of that and create, whether we call it the final draft or maybe we'll call it draft number 2, just in case. But then the question I guess that I have would be, what happens when we have draft number 2? Do we come back to council? Do we go engage?
Then come back to council, and then we'll talk about the engagement.
Yeah, I think you bring it to us first.
Okay, and
So
walk
we're comfortable
full
with
presentation
what
through
we
the
want
draft
you to
number
go
2?
to public.
Yeah, okay, great.
I have one comment. I can't remember where I saw it. I've been trying to find it for the last 10 minutes, but there was somewhere in there where in a zone that permitted a number of residential dwelling units, and we didn't require any stormwater management plan until we were up to, like, it was not more than 9 units or something like that.
Right,
That's a lot.
yeah.
Yeah.
To me, it should be triggered after like 2 or 3 units. You should be having the impact, because you're making a lot of impermeable surface when you create parking for residential units, and you should be required to manage that stormwater. Anybody who's getting a building like that put next to them is going to want that stormwater controlled.
Right.
Pre and
Yeah,
post.
that's become a bigger issue all the time.
So that 9 units is way too much.
Yeah,
Should
okay,
be
so
like
that is, yeah, that's in the general provisions on page 67, and you're right, it says basically residential developments containing 9 or more dwelling units, or commercial, institutional, or light industrial developments with a gross floor area over 1,000 meters squared, or when 20 or more parking spaces are required, shall submit a drainage plan prepared by an engineer.
Basically, the guy that's putting the
Yeah.
ensuite,
Yeah,
he doesn't need one.
right.
But if you're doing 3 or more,
So
this
3
is
or
a
more
business
or
for
more.
you,
Yep.
and you should be required to control your stormwater.
Right, so what about the, so absolutely we could make that change. What about the commercial
Commercial size.
So it's 1,000 meters squared of floor.
Anything
Is that too
commercial
big?
should require a
Anything?
stormwater
Okay.
management plan.
Is
And
that,
that's reasonable.
yep, consensus? Okay, great, thank you for raising that.
Okay, thank you, Garth.
That's great, thank you all for your patience and
Okay,
time.
now I got a couple of things to say. One is we are canceling the workshop because we're never gonna get through the agenda we'll get through the agenda and hopefully by 1:30.
Yeah, Derek's gonna go.
Yeah, so we're canceling the workshop and move it till
Yeah, or keep it if you,
next week.
you can just leave it, I'll pick them up.
And other than that, I'm having a 5-minute break before I start this next bunch of stuff.